definitely I would say they're not sustainable. If you look at most of actually Africa is urbanizing the fastest of any continent. So cities, are growing quite fast. In the next 20, 30 years, more people will live in cities than in rural areas. So even today, so you can imagine today they're not sustainable. So in the future, they will not be, they'll be worse actually. So what I can say is that looking at the situation today, how do people move from one place to the other, to work, to office? So how do people move? And I would say therefore sort of like three key areas or modes of transport. So the first, you'll find that a lot of people walk in African cities. If you look at, for example, at a city like Dar es Salaam, almost 40-something percent of the people walk. Another 40-something percent of the people use informal transport. And only a small segment, about 6%. Most cities, 6% to 8% of the people use private cars.
I think the most unsustainable thing about the current transport system globally is that it is very focused on the individual passenger car. Okay. And if you look at Western markets, that's what's happened. If you look at the United States, what is it? It's almost one car per person, not quite, but almost one car per person. And if you imagine now Africa, a continent which is going to have 1.2 billion people, if it develops in exactly the same way as a place like the United States or even the majority of Europe, that is absolutely unsustainable. There's no way we address the climate crisis, even with electrification. There's no way we address the climate crisis if that's successful. So instead, what we need to do is create really effective methods of both public transport and shared passenger transport, right? Which is in many ways a form of public transport. And that's what you're starting to see here. So I think one thing that's really exciting about Africa is you are seeing in many ways these shared models, ride-sharing models, or these models around motorbikes and micro-mobility, and then combined with the electrification of public transport, the formalization of public transport, all of this working together to ideally create a new transport ecosystem as compared to the traditional model of development that we've seen the rest of the world over,
And what we found is that, for example, a truck going to Uganda, Kampala or Jinja, it spends about 80% of its travel in Kenya. So it's a Ugandan truck, but it's spending a lot of 80% of the travel is through Kenya. So, there's no way you can have emission standards in Uganda, not in Kenya, because that truck will emit more in the neighboring countries, before it goes to its destination. Then, at the same time, Rwanda had implemented very strict standards for emissions, but these other countries had not. So trucks would be stopped, from entering Rwanda, and they passed all the way, So the need for regional harmonization of standards. And that's one of the things that we're doing. How do we bring regions that are interlinked, interrelated into having a unified standard so that you're able to, all promote sustainable transport, low emission transport, so that you're able to do trade in a more sustainable manner. It's actually also important to have a regional standard as well. For example, South Africa, Durban, for example, is a major port hub for these used vehicles going to Malawi, going to Zambia, going to Zimbabwe. And you'll find South Africa does not allow used vehicles in their countries, and they have some moderate emission standards. So these vehicles going into those countries are imported into Durban, but they're not allowed to drive through South Africa. So they have to be on the vehicle carrier because of the emissions. Yes. So because they don't want to, these vehicles to emit to be hazard in South Africa. So they actually loaded onto vehicles to be exported. So the need for regional standards, the regional integration, I think would be able to open up Africa for business, and also, make business easier and movement of goods, and people a lot easier.
In sub-Saharan Africa, our transport systems are insane. Insane is the right word. I like to call it the Wild West. And the main reason being that the way that Africa has developed, right? In much of the Western world, what we saw was streetcars, which were public infrastructure, slowly evolved into being a public bus sector. Here, it's been very different. We started as taxis and minibus taxis that have slowly grown in size over time to become larger minibus taxis and buses. And so as a result, that's why we have a private sector operating market that has been thinly regulated and very uncontrolled. I think as Africa develops, especially, what are we seeing? How many megacities are we going to have on the African continent in the next decade? We're going to need to formalize. Government is going to need to take a greater role in terms of the regulation and formalization of this sector in order to improve economics, in order to improve sustainability, in order to reduce congestion, right? You cannot have a city of 10 to 15 million people and run just a completely unregulated public transit industry. Fortunately, I think that we're starting to see the early stages of that. Look at Dar es Salaam. Dar es Salaam recently launched a bus rapid transit link. Look at Nairobi, where we've launched our first commuter rail. I think you're going to start to see more and more projects like this, where government is taking an increased role in investment in public infrastructure and formalization of the public transport sector. And that's the only way we will be able to move people and goods in these cities in a way that just doesn't completely paralyze the city.
They said about 40-something% of the people walk. Another 40-something% of the people actually use informal transport, public transport. How do we actually make that transport more sustainable and more efficient? Because those are the two modes we want people to use for more sustainability: walking and using public transport. The informal transport today, everybody's looking at how do I get out of it, because it's not time-wise, you don't know what time you will leave. It is not clean, it is not efficient. So we need to move towards more efficient and cleaner public transport.
And the problem that we really identified was around the air pollution originating from diesel buses here. And diesel buses are by far and away the most necessary form of transport that we have here in Nairobi, because they're so affordable and so accessible for the vast majority of people trying to commute and live their daily lives. But at the same time, the problem is we have unprecedented emissions from these diesel buses polluting the air. And we actually saw this firsthand in the first few days of COVID, when the government forced all the diesel buses to stop for a brief period of time, and the air in the city just completely cleared. And we had a glimpse of what would happen if you were able to there was a BBC article about this, about how the air pollution in many of these mega cities began to clear, and Nairobi was part of it. We were able to see Mount Kenya 350 kilometers away for the first time in almost 30 years. So that was the problem, but there's also an incredible opportunity, and that is, as we know, the climate crisis is only getting worse. And all over the world, there's a focus on how can we electrify our public transport sector. This has been identified as one of the key things we need to do to address climate emissions. And what we have is we have a unique opportunity in East Africa, because the electricity grid in this region, it already has some of the cleanest electricity in the world.
A lot of the cities are looking at dedicated public transport corridors. If you look at many cities, similar to what Dar es Salaam has done, Lagos is already doing BRT Light, Nairobi is planning, Johannesburg already has a Rea Vaya. So a lot of the other cities, actually, Ethiopia, Addis, they are thinking of the same. They are thinking of having bus corridors because they are cheaper than the light rail. So these bus corridors need to, of course, be as extensive as possible, where people, are traveling to and from, but also from an environmental angle for us, we're also asking government, do you also look at the kind of buses that will operate on those corridors? Are they as clean as possible? And, to reduce the emissions? Because, of course, if you look at Africa again, transport emissions are on the increase. Almost a city like Nairobi, about half of the emissions that are harmful to people actually from transport.